Good morning, students. Today's lecture is Michel Foucault, and we'll be discussing the life and works of Michel Foucault. And Foucault is, as we all know, is such a wide and vivid and multi-dimensional personality that it is not possible to cover all of his life and works into one single lecture. So I have divided this into two parts, this lecture into two parts. This is the first part where we'll be discussing the biography and some of the works of Foucault. So Michel Foucault, this is his picture. You can see a philosopher kind of look and a critical look on his face. So Michel Foucault, who's born on 1926 and died in 1984. He was a French historian and philosopher associated with the structuralist and post-structuralist movements. He has had strong influence not only or even primarily in philosophy but also in wide range of humanistic and social scientific disciplines. So, the biographical sketch of Foucault will go like this. Foucault was born in Poitiers, France on October 15, 1926. As a student, he was brilliant, but he was psychologically tormented. He became academically established during the 1960s, holding a series of positions at French universities. Before his election in 1969 to ultra-prestigious Collège de France, where he was professor of the history of systems of thought until his death. So, from the 1970s on, Foucault's very active politically. He was a founder of the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons and often protested on behalf of marginalized groups. He frequently lectured outside France, particularly in United States, and in 1983 had agreed to teach annually at the University of California at Berkeley. An early victim of AIDS, Foucault died in Paris on June 25, 1984. In addition to works published during his lifetime, his lectures at the Collège de France, published posthumously, containing important elucidations and extensions of his ideas. So one might question whether Foucault is in fact a philosopher. His academic formation was in psychology and its history, as well as in philosophy. His books are mostly histories of medical and social sciences. His passions were literary and political. Nonetheless, almost all of Foucault's works can be fruitfully read as philosophical in either or both of two ways, as carrying out philosophy's traditional critical project in a new historical manner and as a critical engagement with the thought of traditional philosophers. This article will present him as a philosopher in these two dimensions. So, the intellectual background. Now we begin, however, with the sketch of the philosophical environment in which Foucault was educated. He entered the École Normale Supérieure, the standard launching pad for major French philosophers, in 1946. During the heyday of existential phenomenology, Merleau-Ponty, whose lectures he attended, and Heidegger were particularly important. Hegel and Marx were also major interests. Hegel, through the interpretation of his work offered by Jean Hippolyte, and Marx through the structuralist reading of Louis Althusser, both teachers who had a strong impact on Foucault at the École Normale. It is not surprising that Foucault's earliest works, his long introduction to Jacqueline Baudiac's French translation of Traum and Existence by Ludwig Binswanger, a Heideggerian psychiatrist, and Melody Mental at Personalite, a short book on mental illness, were written in the grip of respectively existentialism and Marxism, but he soon turned away from both. Now, Jean-Paul Sartre, working outside the university system, had no personal influence on Foucault, but as a French master thinker of the previous generation, he is always in the background. Like Sartre, Foucault began from a relentless hatred of bourgeois society and cultural and with a spontaneous sympathy for marginal groups such as the mad, homosexuals, and prisoners. They both also had strong interest in literature and psychology as well as philosophy, and both. After an early relative lack of political interest, became committed activist. Made in the end, Foucault seemed to insist on defining himself in contradiction to Sartre. Philosophically, he rejected when he saw as Sartre's privileging of the subject, which he mocked as transcendental narcissism. Personally and politically, he rejected Sartre's role as what Foucault called a universal intellectual, judging society by appeals to universal moral principles such as the inviolability of individual freedom. There is, however, more than a hint of protesting too much in Foucault's rejection of Sartre, and the question of relation of their works remain a fertile one. Three other factors of much more positive significance for the young Foucault. First, there was the French tradition of history and philosophy of science, particularly as presented by Georges Canguilhem, a powerful figure in French university establishment, whose work in the history and philosophy of biology provided a model for much of Foucault's work in the history of the human sciences. Canguilhem sponsored Foucault's doctoral thesis on history of madness, and throughout Foucault's career remained one of his most important and effective supporters. Canguilhem's approach to the history of science, an approach developed from the work of Gaston Bachelard, provided Foucault with a strong sense in some which Cohnian event a letter see entry or scientific revolutions, section 5.3 of the discontinuities in scientific history, along with the rationalist understanding of the historical role of concepts that made them independent of phenomenologist transcendental consciousness. Foucault found this understanding reinforced in the structuralist linguistics and psychologically developed respectively by Ferdinand de Saussure and Jacques Lacan, as well as in Georges Dumézil's proto-structuralist work on comparative religion. These anti-subjective standpoints provide the context for Foucault's marginalization on the subject in his structuralist histories. The Birth of the Clinic, on the Origins of Modern Medicine and the Order of Things, on the origins of modern human sciences. In a quite different vein, Foucault was enthralled by French avant-garde literature, especially the writings of Georges Bataille and Maurice Blanchard, where he found the experimental concreteness of existential phenomenology without what he became to see as dubious philosophical assumptions about subjectivity. Of particular interest was this literature's evocation of limit experiences, which push us to extremes where conventional categories of intelligibility begin to break down. This philosophical milieu provided materials for the critique of subjectively and corresponding archaeologically and genealogical methods of writing history that inform Foucault's projects of historical critiques, to which we will now turn, and we will read about those historical works in the next lecture. Thank you very much.